and certainly someone who has a flair for the English language that I always look forward to hearing him speak. And I know looks forward to the human side of the sport just as much as the competitive side. So without any more waiting, Dave.
Let me run a few words by you for effect. Can you hear me? Okay. Armed to the teeth as I am, I feel ready to go to the Ukraine. Get in the battle. First of all, I want to introduce you to Ken Howell, an old friend, a dear friend, and the thought crossed my mind at one point that I should have brought his two daughters with me as a show and tell, because they both swam for me. They were state champions. They were gold medalists. They were state record holders, record breakers. And the youngest walked away from her senior year at Denison having won both the 200 and the 400 IM. So they were... I think I'm almost as proud of them as is Ken. And he's been involved in Mexico swimming for a long time, and not as a coach, but as one of those wonderful parents that we all are familiar with, to help in any way he can with the sport of swimming, and especially in the technical side of it. I noticed in the title that you have in your program, which was taken, I think, from 3 years ago, and the subtitle was A Rising Tide of Sense, Sentiment, and Sensibility. And I want to tell you, there ain't no sense in this particular talk today. I'll get to that in the course of events here. And because this light is somewhat dim, I'm going to... Most of us coaches are well acquainted with the whole concept of what's called a work in progress. And especially so when that kind of energy devotes itself to building a swim program. Many of you know that all too well. The end product of those transitions seldom resemble their beginnings, or at least one might hope so. Such is the case with my remarks here this afternoon. In their aborted infancy, these thoughts about little girls were intended for presentation 3 years ago in Austin, Texas. The thrust of that line of thought was designed specifically to take NISCA to the woodshed, so to speak, for having dragged its feet over time regarding amending our Constitution to require require mandated attendance in alternate years NCAA Division I Women's Championship meets. But that's old business now. Water under the bridge, as it were. And a reprimand would hardly be appropriate today in view of your willingness to do what indeed you did do 2 years ago on Zoom in Indianapolis by voting to adjust this organization's constitutional thinking. So you may be wondering why I'm back here this afternoon trumpeting this old business about something called little girls. Because it would have been easy enough to scrub these remarks and consider them totally passé, since the proposal thrust upon you in Austin initially has not only been addressed, but passed. But no, here I am again, answering the call, so to speak, this time from your president, Thanks, Tom, for putting me on deck again. To put in place, hopefully, the final punctuation mark on this whole matter of gender recognition, at least so far as our annual conventions are concerned. I might remind you at this point that the issue of gender recognition should not be confused with anything having to do with the current and thorny perplexity of transgender identification, a matter which might be addressed by this gathering at some point in time as we move forward with not only these proceedings, but our deliberations in the future. That ball of wax aside, here's a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. The primary stitch that binds all this pitter-patter together is the red thread of history. Some of it personal, some of it American, some of it global. And I would add that somewhere in the content of these remarks, I would hope something of what I have to say will energize your own memories of some of the little girls who have filtered in and out of your charge over the years. So on to the fray, so to speak. I want to begin these thoughts chronologically by recalling something about the little girls of my youth and their beginning presence in my consciousness, and what that had to do or not to do with sport. And then, metaphorically speaking, something about tides, too, since mention of them appears in the subtitle to these remarks. And then finally, a little bit of family stuff thrown in for good or inexcusable measure. In life as well as in sport, women have come a long, long way in this wide, wide world of ours. But before they became women, some of them were little girls at a time in my life when I was a little boy in their company, many, many years ago. In that light, I would ask you to allow me a little momentary elegaic license here, if you will, to embrace a thought or two about those little girls and their lack of license, as it were, to participate in sports of any kind, let alone anything so lofty as something called the Olympics. I can't remember exactly when it was that I first noticed little girls. Oh, in some sort of vague way, I suppose, like many of you, I always knew they were there somewhere out there on the edge of things. But they might just as well have existed on another planet for all the notice or lack thereof they seem to generate from little boys, especially at recess time in grammar school, during the swan song years of the Great Depression, followed by the Advent years of World War II, where the playgrounds of my youth rise in memory from the dust of rough and tumble games, marked mostly by small-town ethnic alliances and chip-on-the-shoulder confrontations, the give and take of which taught little boys to stand up for themselves in matters of what they later came to understand as something the Greeks called hubris. Little girls, on the other hand, weren't into any of that puff and puff stuff, that chip-on-the-shoulder stuff. They lived a more sedate, more respectable life, at least at recess time, where they hung out on stoops and sidewalks, jumping rope, or bouncing a little ball up and down, playing jacks in the sun, or strolling nonchalantly around the playground hand in hand with old-maid school teachers on the lookout for out-of-order ruffians disguised as little boys. A few war years later in junior high school, little girls began to emerge individually here and there in my gender consciousness, and especially so since they began to engage for the very first time in their educational lives, at least, a mandated concession of sort called simply gym. My memory of gym in junior high evokes mostly moments of curiosity, energized, if I can find it, energized by momentary peeping Tom imagery of little girls moving about in those funny-looking baggy blue bloomer suits they wore behind a black floor-to-ceiling barrier stretched across the middle of a gymnasium. Beyond that black divide, called the modesty curtain, for those who seem to know about such things, there lurked a tacit mentality embroidered by an entrenched reluctance to fully entertain the possibility of the sweeter side of sexuality actually sweating. Beyond gym, that is. That rather parochial view of exercise for little girls in small-town New England has prompted me to reconstruct a personal and more universal evocation of the situation, all of which is driven by my experience of worldwide displacement during World War II and its immediate post-war years, resulting in not only a personal revelation of gender limitations for little girls in sport, but a global one as well. In that light, consider this upheaval in my life. When I was an impressionable teenager, cursed not only by most of the endocrine horrors of adolescence we all remember, but by a deeply rooted sense of self-consciousness as well. My journey through that wilderness of callow youth and adolescent trial and tribulation had far less to do with acne and social anemia than with a severe case of geographical confusion, as it were, harnessed to a state of mind that has prompted me to cobble together a linguistic mumbo-jumbo of more words than any revelation about anything perhaps deserves. Its complexity attempts to untangle a discordant condition, the kind of situational chaos, as it were, existing in my life back then, a life that spun me from one continent to another, and then from one hemisphere to another, and then retrofired me back again what appeared to be, at least in the magnification of childhood retrospect, the mere blink of an eye. You can imagine the drift in my sense of place and direction in those days. The climax of these thoughts, this whirlwind of words, if you will, ends most significantly with a mild philippic aimed at what appeared to be a universal mentality that prevented a little girl's presentation in a sport of any kind. Now I want to come back to that word philippic. It's an unusual word. I like that word because it sounds so good coming off your tongue. It means, in its basic meaning, a rant or a raving about some sort of a horrific situation. What follows, in italic text, I might add, is my little philippic about this business of being transported all over the world, interruption after interruption, here one day, gone the other. Had I not had a mirror twin brother, it would have been an unbearable situation. Pulled out of practice field, pulled out of sports. It was a very irregular kind of life, and especially during, as I said before, high school years. Well, anyway, hang on to this, and then we'll get down to the little girls. When World War II, and then its immediate aftermath, uprooted me from the parochial comfort of small-town New Hampshire and introduced me to a much wider world by bouncing me up and down, north and south, east and west, back and forth, to and fro, from one side of North America to the other, and then to a tiny tropical island located at the end of an ocean somewhere south of the Philippines and north of an upside-down under island continent, inhabited at one time by more koalas and kangaroos and convicts than by free citizens, Australia. And then after that to an airless, sweaty, hot, and humid place, situated just above the planet's equatorial midsection on an S-shaped bend of land called an isthmus, a twisted topography of jungle and jitney guttered by a wonder of work that connected two oceans, one to another, east and west, by magically lifting and lowering levels of water north and south. Panama Canal. In all this conspiracy of compass, this war-torn, post-war, Pacific Island exotica, this Panamanian profundity, this geographical upheaval, this situational confusion, this incessant nomadic meandering from one curve of the globe to the other, I never once, not a single solitary time that I can remember ever, encountered a singular athletic opportunity by itself for little girls, beyond cheering for little boys, doing manly things, that is. Intellectually, the bottom line of all of this was that while the opportunity and curiosities of world travel at an early age might have broadened and sophisticated my mind culturally, when it came to the reality of sport for the opposite gender, not only opportunity, but pleasure too, it seemed to evaporate. Truthfully, like many of you, I suspect, I didn't think much about that disparity, that odd state of affairs, until a little later in life, until the early 1960s to be exact, when I entered into what has now surpassed a 60-year career of teaching and coaching literally thousands of little girls. Which leads me to my subtitle and the symbolic idea of sentiment and sensibility, and something called a rising tide. 12 years following the genesis of that professional initiation to the ways of little girls, that seemingly worldwide odd state of affairs I mentioned a moment ago, began to disintegrate in part, at least illegally, when the American congressional enactment of Title IX was passed in 1972. In retrospect, that legislation initiated a tidal wave, a tsunami of sorts, or at the very least, a swelling surge of femininity in what is now an endless cresting wave of not only American women athletes competing in a plethora of sports, but an endless wave of women from around the world as well. Before I go any further talking about tides, an apology might be in order here of at least one of you, who sadly is not here today, but I'll mention him anyway. I'm thinking here of your good friend, and mine of many years, and one of Nishka's most loyal and legendary constituents, that old down Mainer himself, Phil Emery, who undoubtedly knows a lot more about tides than either I or the rest of us do, since the most spectacular fill and draw of water in the world occurs daily near his doorstep in the spectacular Bay of Fundy. Tom Waslovovich knows that part of the world. An ever-changing body of water that separates Phil from the world around him, or at least to the east of him. Despite all that spectacular in and out and up and down of water, here's what little I know about tides, which is certainly not the case about extended metaphor, as you will soon learn. Tides are oceanic phenomena, as you all know. Sometimes merely a subtle wash of water slowly caressing an idyllic sandy beach somewhere. Or they're a echoic opposite, a spectacular crash of snow-capped waves exploding in a cloud of white fury against a rocky shore. Two scenarios that Phil, as well as Tom Waslovovich, and any of you who have ever traveled those waters know all too well. In either case, subtlety or suddenness, flood tides are always followed by a gradual withdrawal of water called an ebb tide. But contrary to this natural and rhythmic condition of oceanography, there has not been any hesitation, certainly no interruption, no withdrawal, and certainly no ebbing in the flood tide of American water women since they initially impacted the modern Olympic movement 101 years ago last summer by sweeping the swimming and springboard diving medals in 1920 at the games of the 7th Olympiad of the modern era in the World War I war-torn city of Antwerp, Belgium. For the prospective record, I might add, those moments of the 1920 games were conducted in the immediate echo of American women finally gaining the congressional right to vote. Perhaps without fully realizing it then, those first other American Olympic girls, led by triple gold medal winner Imelda Bleibtree, who really wasn't so little, by the way, and especially, lost my place, and especially so when you compare her physiognomy with her tiny teammate, 14-year-old diving whiz Eileen Riggin, whose 4'7" and 65-pound stature was practically Pygmy-esque by any measure. Together, Bleibtree and Riggin would initiate a standard of excellence in our sport that would endure for what is now a century-long flood tide of American, Olympic, and I would add, World Championship medals, many of them gold. American female presence in swimming and diving in those 1920 games edged open the Olympic portal, as it were, and literally blazed a trail for future legions of American women athletes to follow in a wide array of sports. But the moment of that swimming and diving moment aside, and beyond the glow and glory of their mere presence in Belgium, there lay in the rearview mirror of their debut in Antwerp a philosophical flotsam, rendered by a long and arduous journey fraught with all the bitter litter of angst, argument, animus, and opposition that a largely male sporting establishment comprised of the big wigs and muckety-mucks of American amateur sport could drum up for obviating an American woman's presence in international competition. Permit me a sidebar here, if you will. I had the honor and the privilege of sharing a private moment with the diminutive Eileen Riggin, quarter of a century ago in 1995, to be exact, at the National Convention of Sports Historians aboard the Queen Mary in Long Beach, California, where she was being honored by a worldwide society of sports historians as the oldest living American Olympic gold medalist at that point in time. Riggin was almost my age now, nearing 90 years old, and had somehow managed to retain not only bits and pieces of her girlish manner, but much of the awe associated with her youthful experience on that world stage in Belgium so many, many years before. She underscored her Olympic experience in the driving rain of Europe's low countries and the murky depths of Belgium's seaside swimming and diving venue by saying simply, just being there in Antwerp was an exotic adventure. And then she added, somewhat wistfully, a footnote, in the darkest of waters, which I might add became just a bit more exotic and certainly less darker for her 4 years later in the City of Light at the now so-called Chariots of Fire Olympic Games in Paris in 1924, where she became the only woman ever in Olympic history to date to win individual medals in both swimming and diving. In her case, silver in 3-meter springboard diving and bronze in the 100-meter backstroke. By the way, most of us remember that stunning 1981 Oscar-winning British film, Chariots of Fire, which gleaned its title from the lyrics of England's most cherished hymn, Jerusalem. Long before I ever saw the film, I became well acquainted with that hymn, the lyrics of which were taken from the pen of 19th century British poet William Blake, including his mythological references to a bow of burning gold, arrows of desire, and a chariot of fire. I sang Jerusalem at 6 commencement exercises in Christchurch at the Cranbrook School for Boys in Michigan back in the 60s. And I can remember vividly how its profound sound inspired me and my faculty colleagues, as well as 3 forms of Cranbrook boys, to raise our voices on high to honor Blake's words, even though most of us had only a marginal understanding of the lyrics. Hymns and history aside, the film's plot, you will remember, concerned the trials and tribulations of 2 British Olympians, Harold Abrahams, an English Jew who ran to overcome prejudice and win gold in the 100-meter dash, and Eric Liddell, a devout Scottish Christian who ran to serve his Lord and win gold in the 400-meter run. As truly wonderful as that film was, including its cherished and Academy Award-winning musical score, it had absolutely nothing to say about an American women's swim team that dominated the competition in those games from beginning to end in that Paris pool on the banks of the River Seine in 1924, despite the medical limitations of their star swimmer and multiple world record holder at that time, the incomparable Gertrude Edwards, who 2 years later would become not only America's girl, but the entire planet's girl as well. When she became the first woman ever to swim the English Channel, and in a time almost 2 hours faster than any male had ever swum it at that. So much for the crawl stroke compared with the laborious and retardant breaststroke of that era. The fanfare of Italy's triumph over the frigid and whimsical currents of the English Channel in August of 1926 provided a global population with much more than merely the idea of conquest, or even thoughts about the simplicity of mind over matter. Indeed, greater significance lay in how Italy's astonishing feat impacted the psychology of American women and American men alike. Italy's performance endowed both genders with a heightened sense of respect for what a woman was able to achieve in the middle of that golden age of sport, an era marked by male-dominated headlines, atop a culture iconicized in by the glamour of male achievement and its primary achievers. The Lone Eagle, Charles Lindbergh. Lou Gehrig, the Iron Horse. The Galloping Ghost, Red Grange. The Manassas Mauler, Jack Dempsey. And, of course, at the very top of that totem, the Sultan of Swat, Babe Ruth. Diminishing to an extent the idea of masculine superiority, Italy's Channel Swim put to a test and into rest many of the limitations commonly associated at that time with the widespread notion portraying women as a weaker sex. Indeed, the end of that immediate post-World War I era and the decade of the Roaring Twenties that followed sensitized not only a worldwide awareness of a woman's capability, but of her capacity as well. All of which serves us today, at least in part, as a genesis of sorts for the current day respect accorded women athletes everywhere. With notable exceptions, American women swimmers and divers, and then much later in the 20th century, water polo players and synchronized swimmers, would continue this country's residence atop the victory podium in one Olympic gathering after another. One of the earliest and most glamorous of the Olympic champions was the beautiful but controversial Eleanor Holmes, the reigning world record holder in the 100-meter backstroke in those days, and the Olympic gold medalist in that event at the Los Angeles Games in 1932, the year I was born, I might add, in case you've been wondering, doing the math. 4 years later, aboard the SS Manhattan, on the American Olympic team's voyage to Germany for the 36 games in Berlin, Holmes' persistent, often inebriated, and almost always profane vocal dissatisfaction with the accommodations assigned to the women's swim team aboard ship ultimately resulted in her removal from the American Olympic team. The subsequent reaction to her dismissal included, metaphorically speaking, thumbing her nose at Avery Brundage and the American Olympic Committee by seeking and keeping company in Berlin with several high-ranking Nazi officials, including German Reich Minster propagandist Joseph Goebbels and Luftwaffe Air Marshal Hermann Göring, and then ultimately with even the Chancellor himself, Herr Hitler, who, by the way, satisfied a personal desire of his, Hitler I'm talking about, during the games to seek out and speak personally with another namesake of German heritage, named Adolf, spelled differently, I might add. I speak here of NISCA's legendary member and friend of many years, Adolf Kiefer, the 1936 Olympic gold medalist and world record holder in the 100-meter backstroke. One could only wish that Adolf was still here today. Kiefer, that is, and not the other. And that I could call upon him to rise from his wheelchair and stand up at this precise moment in the middle of this gathering and give us the straight skinny on Eleanor Holmes' contretemps aboard the SS Manhattan, as well as the fallout from her obstreperous behavior days later in Berlin. Now, wouldn't that have been something? I think many of us, certainly the old-timers who knew Adolf well, and remember that his last days here at NISCA spent in the wheelchair, but he came to NISCA. Holmes, by the way, bears a striking resemblance, or could it be the other way around, to at least one of my mother's photographs, taken at a similar age. No matter. And similarity aside, there are a couple of appropriate reasons, I think, for risking some kind of convention censure here, for daring to dig into one of my family's old photo albums and juxtapose my mother's photograph with that of a past Olympic champion, albeit a femme fatale of sorts, who possessed more than a mere willingness to embrace a kind of nightclub behavior that was considered not only irreverent, but scandalous in those days. To the contrary, my mother was never really guilty of any of that naughty girl stuff, at least I know of. But like Holmes, she never passed up an opportunity to assert her feminine independence in the culture possessing radically different standards of behavior for women at that point in time than it did for men. One example of that condition has something to do with swimming, and especially a woman's swimming attire in that day and age. The stylistic middle way of which teetered precariously on a high wire of sorts, located seemingly somewhere between the last vestiges of something called biblical modesty and a radical state of mind known as post-Victorian New Wave liberalism. In my mother's particular case, and like many young women of the so-called flapper era, of the 1920s, she yearned to keep, pardon the pun here, abreast of style, including the latest fashions in bathing suits for women, the rage of which at that particular time was the revolutionary revealing Annette Kellerman's form-fitting to the max swimsuit. Speaking of Kellerman, I'm sure that at least some of you will remember Annette Teaser's piece about Kellerman, which appeared in the Niska Journal over a year or so ago, beneath the title of The Original $1 Million Mermaid. In reality, a 1952 film featuring the beautiful and photogenic movie star Esther Williams, posing as Kellerman. Williams' induction into the International Swimming Hall of Fame in 1966 provides us with some understanding of her considerable influence in the swimming world. Long after many of us old-timers have forgotten some of the more ballyhooed swimming stars in our history, we tend to remember Esther Williams movies, and her graceful cinematographic presence in those elegant choreographies that ultimately influenced and then later popularized synchronized swimming competition for little girls. But back to the issue of swimming suits. You can probably imagine my modest, Methodist, maternal grandmother's reaction to her daughter's lengthy and petulant demands for a Kellerman swimsuit, which even in those pre-bikini days tended to reveal everything about a woman but her social security number. A metaphorical liberty I have thrust upon you here since there was no social security at that particular point in time. In the end, my mother's persistence won out on the swimsuit issue, but so did my resolute grandmother's stand on another matter of even greater importance, which bears mentioning here since it concerns another fundamental issue regarding little girls being shut out of things arbitrarily. That situation had little to do with swimming attire, but more to do with the matter of sheer gender discrimination regardless of ability. In this particular case, musical talent. My mother was a wonderful pianist, practically a prodigy at the famous New England Conservatory of Music in the early 1920s, according to the Boston Globe's music critics of that era. She had played since she was 6, taught several piano students by the time she was 16, played professionally when she was 18. She also played trumpet and cornet, and following several heated arguments with school officials, and then her mother's ultimately successful petition and appearance before the city of Malden, Massachusetts School Board, she became not only the first, but the only girl in one of the nation's first ever high school marching bands. And then a couple of weeks later, she became the leader of it as well. It wasn't long after that moment in time that little girls began to appear here and there in several high school marching bands in and around the city of Boston. Permit me another elegiac postscript here. I really apologize for this because it really is sentimental. 15 years later in Vermont, long after the Malden High School Marching Band had made its final seasonal signature serpentine march down Main Street in Malden, for a Saturday afternoon football game, my mother would magically produce her trumpet and playfully summon my twin brothers and me to the radio on Lone Ranger nights, with that trumpet call we all know so well from the opera William Tell. On other nights, when the spirit moved her to do so, she ushered us up the stairs to bed on the clear, quieting strains of the military call to rest, tap. Well, so much for my mother. And Annette Kellerman bathing suit. And the historic Malden High School Marching Band. And so much for the Lone Ranger and the William Tell Overture and taps, too. And while I'm at it, so much for Revelation, and the sweet sentiment of an almost 104-year-old mother who lived long enough in her lifetime to cheer on the exploits of this almost 100-year-old galaxy of American women swimming and diving stars. Most of you old-timers will recognize all 12 of them. Younger members, I would guess, would do well to recognize just the 21st century stars. Allow me to refresh your memories. Sorry we don't have the real clarity we need here, but maybe you can see. From left to right, top to bottom, Ann Curtis, Pat McCormick, Shelley Mann, Mickey King, Debbie Meyer, Natalie Coughlin, Janet Evans, Dara Torrey. That's why I got them out of order. And recently, of course, Katie Ledecky. Each of these little girls, and like so many others not pictured here, would crowd the shadows cast so long ago in a much more modest but significant way by the pioneers of our sport, Blightry, Riggin, and Ederle, and yes, even Eleanor Holmes in her own disruptive way. In summary, there has been very little slowing in the distaff flow of American Olympic medals in aquatic events, and especially gold ones. In addition, the Olympic Record Board has become a Mount Olympus state of residence for American women. New events added to the women's program in 1956 and 60, and then a surge of 6 new events in 1968 at the Mexico City Games, followed by the addition of synchronized and water polo team events for women near the end of the 20th century, served only to heighten America's medal haul for women in aquatic events. In doing so, American women have perhaps more responsible for recognition of another sort, something perhaps as equally significant in the grand scheme of things as all those Olympic records and gold medals. I speak here of the notion of parity, absolute parity, at least so far as Olympic participation standards in swimming and diving are concerned. In the 2021 recalcitrated Tokyo Games of last summer, and for the first time ever in Olympic history, women of the world swam and dived in a gender of events that mirrored exactly what men swam in both stroke and distance. The onset of all that, by the way, occurred in 2008 in Beijing when the 10K swim was added to the agenda of events for men. And then after much discussion, why not? Sanity prevailed, and there was also a 10K swim for women, which ultimately led to, of course, 1,500 for women, and a step down at 800 for men in Tokyo Games last summer. Well, so much for equanimity achieved over time, a long time. But what about the here and now for women athletes in general? And not just American women either. Initially, a little grist might be in order here, and especially so far as the modern world stage is concerned. In a nutshell, and as that old Irish lyric reminds us, women of the world have come a long, long way from Tipperary, or anywhere else for that matter, because as we all remember from watching an English fortnight, around-the-clock television coverage of the 2012 London Games, including, I might add, the reverence paid to the hymn Jerusalem, the official hymn of those games. And then more recently, the Rio Games in 2016, as well as the rescheduled Tokyo Games last summer, the competition became pretty much a celebration of women athletes from all corners of the globe. some of whom became powerful overnight symbols for what is possible in this era at least for little girls through participation in sport. Most significant perhaps in those London Games of 2012 is the fact that for the very first time ever in any Olympiad of the modern era, going back to 1896, every one of the more than 200 national teams competing in England, including a number of arm-twisted Middle Eastern countries, I might add, contained female representation. That demographic aside, it remains another significant quotient relative to gender participation in those games. The bottom line of which is simply there were more women competing in England in 2012 than there were men. And while it may have taken women of the world exactly 100 years of Olympic competition for them to achieve that edge since they first appeared in the Games of 1912 in Stockholm, it provides us with a curiosity, it seems to me, relative to how long women might maintain, indeed enjoy, that advantage. My guess is maybe longer than one might suspect, or that many men in the Olympic hierarchy might be willing to admit, because beyond the sociological impact of their mere presence in London and Rio and Tokyo stands the stunning performance that those women athletes put on for the world. A drama which captured and then held the planet's attention in a televised and magnetized embrace long after the Olympic flame had been extinguished at each of those three most recent international festivals of sport. Following impressive preludes in Sydney in 2000, and then in Athens in 2004, as well as Beijing in 2008, the latest three Olympic challenges reflect not only a worldwide balancing of gender equalization in the Games, but a topping out, if you will, in the medal haul by American water women in particular. Dominating the podium in London in 2012 and serenaded by echo after echo after echo of their national anthem, American women swimmers, divers, and water polo players climbed the victory stand 17 times, including 9 treks to the podium summit. Their medal haul 4 years later in Brazil duplicated to a T their stunning performance in England. In either case, the American water women's medal haul in London and Rio nearly equaled that of American men. Despite a male performance considerably skewed by the extraordinary once-in-a-lifetime, perhaps, gold medal and record-breaking performance by a single male American swimmer. We all know who that was. Most aficionados of Olympic sport are well aware of America's dominance in aquatic events over what has now passed beyond the doorstep of a full century in time. The medium of television, and then more recently the internet has seen to that. Granted, much of that nouveau exposure has focused on you-know-whom, whose mere presence in any body of water, including even a mud puddle, I would guess, has generated most of the hype given over to Olympic and World Championship swimming in this relatively new century of ours. But Phelps is out of the picture now, finally. So if initiation or conjecture counts for anything, then Katie Ledecky's Olympic gold medal showing in the past 3 Olympic Games might suggest that in times perhaps she might possibly rival the attention accorded Michael Phelps and his tenure in the spotlight. And finally, elements of time and circumstance will dictate that eventuality, and especially the element of circumstance, since it encompasses the notion of condition. In this particular case, an extant condition, embracing, believe it or not, those extant little girls of my boyhood, the ones in those baggy blue bloomer suits, cavorting innocently about on the other side of that dark divide in a kind of abstract ballet in absentia, per se. That choreography suggests not only a lament on my part, but the thought that if only I had been born a bit earlier and had been a few years older and wiser back in those days, instead of a runny-nosed pre-adolescent know-nothing about anything, including in some instances simply the difference between left and right and wrong. I would have loved coaching those little girls, those little blue-clad, extant misfits of my youth. And then perhaps, like that Pied Piper of fiction and fable we all remember from our childhood literature, lead them out of the shadows of that limitation of Jim only and into the light of a new day and a new way, a woman's way. I thank you very much for your attention here this afternoon. One more sentence.
One more sentence.
And again, for your constitutional support of little girls 2 years ago. And then finally, for putting up with an old man, an old coach, and some of the sentiments concerning moments that have mattered most in his long and memorable life, and I have had that. And I'm so grateful to be here today at my age to add something, whatever that's worth, to the conference. Thank you very much.
We'd like to thank Dave for not only doing today's speech, but he also spoke at ASCA. He will get two. We will not do this next year. We'll put one. I didn't realize that he had spoken both places, so we got two. Next year we're going to put one. But congratulations very much.
Thank
we
you
really
very much.
appreciate it. You are a voice of NISCA forever. Let's give him one more big round of applause. He's phenomenal.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you all for being patient and attentive for the most